Hey folks, welcome to or welcome back to Oridian Games, a channel dedicated to exploring the breadth of the tabletop hobby, RPGs and war games, mostly. We've got another crafting or terrain building video here for you. Let's get rid of these. That was the last video. And in this one we're going to be taking a look at another unorthodox technique, and that is plaster cloth rock formations. Now, plaster cloth is used generally not so much in terrain construction for RPGs and war games. It's used a lot in the model railroad community and by a lot of diorama enthusiasts. It's used to cover large swaths of ground and give it some support before you start putting on ground cover. It's used in large display mountains where you'd create armatures with wire and tinfoil and newspaper, then lay down plaster cloth, which is cloth with plaster in it, so when you get it wet it hardens, and it's a really easy way to make large landforms. Now, I had some plaster cloth, and I don't use large landforms in my construction because I want my terrain to be playable. If there's just a huge mountain on a board, well, there's no way to place a miniature. So that's why you don't see it a lot used by terrain crafters when it comes to tabletop hobbies. But I had some laying around, and I decided to give it a shot, making strange-looking rock formations that were kind of fantastical. This one forms an arch. And if you're interested, I invite you to stick around and watch how I did this, and hopefully it's useful and inspiring to you. Let's get started. Okay, let's kick this thing off with some tools and materials. First, the plaster cloth itself. You can get the Woodland Scenics plaster cloth or find any number of options on Amazon for pretty cheap, actually. Got some tin foil or aluminum foil. It's no longer used or made out of tin. I'm using Reynolds wrap, and this is some floral wire that I picked up at the dollar store for $1. And this is going to make the substructure and the initial shape of the rock itself. So I'm going to untwist that bad boy, unspool it, cut it out with some wire cutters, and kind of twist it into shape. I'm making an arch for this. And so this will serve as the guide for the tin foil. Alright, once we got that into an arch, gonna cut that for some reason. Why am I doing that? Oh, so it can stand up straight. Okay, cool. Then I'm coming in with some aluminum foil, and in small workable pieces, I'm just wrapping it around to give the arch some shape and some body. And so the plaster cloth is going to go on top of this and make the whole thing hard and unbendable. And I just keep adding this until I get the shape I like. Or think I like. Adding some random outcroppings and some variation to the surface area. I decided that I wanted another, I don't know what we'd call it, another leg to this rock. So I just add some more floral wire and some aluminum foil. Covering up the wire with, more aluminum foil. Okay, you got it. Now what I'm trying to do here, and this actually didn't work out very well, is I'm taking a sculpting tool and trying to gouge out fault lines, or stylized fault lines in the rock surface. This unfortunately didn't pan out the best, but you're able to see it kind of, but definitely not at a normal gaming distance. And you'll see why in a second. Okay, now it's time for the plaster cloth. I unwrap it and start cutting it out into manageable strips. So you may ask yourself, why am I doing this when I could just use XPS foam? The thing is, XPS foam is great for making rock formations. You can make some really amazing rocks, but it's not my favorite thing to work with. I like to get messy, and that's exactly what happens when you dunk the plaster cloth in water and start spreading it all around. covering up the surface area of the rock. Now, there are a lot of gaps in the weave of the plaster cloth, so it's going to need at least 2 layers. I put on 2 layers in this one. And once you get it on there, you're able to smooth out the plaster. And one more piece. And what I'm doing right now is kind of stippling it with my finger, so that it will kind of mess up the surface area of the plaster and look more randomized and less smooth. I'm also spreading the plaster around to make sure that all the seams are concealed, seams between the layers of plaster cloth. Then once that's all done, I post it up in front of a space heater and let that dry. After about an hour, it's going to take longer if you don't have like a hairdryer or a space heater or something, I come in with a sculpting tool and I start carving out fault lines, strata lines, cracks in the rock. This does show up a lot better, but still you can't really see it at a normal gaming distance. This whole project is very much experimental, but I think it has a lot of potential, which is why I made a video. I might revisit it later on, but I think it's pretty cool for a piece of unique scatter terrain. So I'm just coming in, carving out a design. And occasionally there's going to be little strings of this kind of gauzy wrap that the plaster cloth is. I pull on those so that it creates like a really random crack as the string comes up and starts pulling up a little bit of plaster. It creates a pretty random fault line. And unfortunately, since it's all white, it doesn't really show up well on camera. But it'll come through. All these little details will definitely come through in the dry brushing. Okay, you get the idea. Just make whatever design you want on there. Or don't, too. I mean, it looks pretty passable. And then, just to rough it up a little bit more, I'm coming in with a wire brush and just scoring the surface in random ways and directions. Okay, so when everything's dry, you're going to get these little hair fibers, cloth fibers, fabric fibers, whatever they're called. I remove these not by clipping them off with scissors, but by simply burning them off and wiping away the ash. Just take a lighter, and yeah, pretty simple. Okay, let's move on. Now, when that's dry, I'm going to base it. So there's a lot of different ways you can base it. Oh, I also make sure a miniature can stand on top, just because that's cool. So for basing it, the glue I'm using is just Aleene's tacky glue. And I put that on the base and just add spackle. I'm not trying to use a bunch of Sculptamold on this, and I have a ton of wall filler. So I'm just putting it around the edges in big globs and then taking a wet brush and blending it into the terrain and the rock. And that gets thrown in front of the space heater too. Picked it up at a pawn shop for about $8. Great investment, and it dries super quick. But before I do that, actually, I put some boulders into the spackle. Don't need to glue them, just press them right into the wall filler. And when it dries, those things will be affixed in there very well. I'm also adding some medium talus, i.e. some pretty small rocks, and pushing them in as well. Okay, now I have no idea why I did this in this order. I must have just lost my damn mind for a split second, but I end up putting my ground cover down before I paint the rock. Generally, you don't want to do this because I'm going to be using the leopard spotting technique, which we'll go over in a second, and I'll do a complete dedicated video to it in the future. But you essentially make a bunch of washes that dribble down the sides and get into the dirt, and it can actually discolor your ground cover. But since this is a dark brown, it's not going to make too much of a difference. So with the leopard spotting technique, I take 3 different types of colors. One, kind of like a raw umber brown, and a yellow ochre, and a black acrylic paint. Add a couple drops to each pot, and then put a significant amount of water in. I test the consistency on a test piece before committing to it, and it creates a wash of these three colors. So I add the brown first on 1/3 of the surface area of the rock, then the yellow ochre wash on the another third of the rock. So 2/3 of the rock have these two colors, and I decided that my brown was too dark, so I mixed up another brown and spotted it on the rock face as well. And then once those two colors are on, you come in with your black wash, which should be more watered down because black paint's more powerful in this method. And I cover the entire surface of the rock in the black paint. Now, I wanted to try this because you only use the leopard spotting technique on plaster rocks. The plaster is very thirsty for moisture and just sucks up the paint and the pigments when you do this. And I thought, since, it was plaster, I could do this. The technique works marginally well. It looked pretty awful, so I had to come in with a medium gray dry brush to tie everything together, and it was pretty heavy because it was splotchy and the colors didn't really apply that well. I probably won't be doing that in the future, but it ends up looking alright after the dry brushing. And I also put a wash on the boulders and the rocks that surround the plaster cloth rock formation, just so they are somewhat color matched to the rock itself. And I darkened down some of the highlights with some more of that black wash. That's pretty much what I do for painting. Then I add some ground cover. You don't really need to base these rocks if you make them in a certain way that allows them to stand up on their own. However, I decided to base this one. It wasn't my initial plan, but my partner, she said that the rock I had chosen to make looked like a giant mangled, well, for lack of a better word, a giant mangled. So I had to base it and put a bunch of ground cover all around it so that, it looked like a rock and not something else. So I'm trying to disguise the phallic shape of the rock that I made. Personally, I didn't see it, but when she brought it up, I couldn't get it out of my mind. I just couldn't, so I had to base it. It's bullshit. Alright, now putting some moss on, because I want this to match the deadfall trees, because I'm doing a whole scatter series. Also, disguising the shape with varying textures of different flocks. Oh, then I take a vine to further disguise it, add some white flowers to it, and just spray on some tacky glue. Put it on the rock. Okay, and then for further disguising operations, I put some deadfall leaning up against the rock and around the surrounding area, on top of the rock, just dressing up this rock so it looks, yeah, And guys, that's pretty much it. So this was very experimental. I am not super pumped about how it came out, but I definitely think this technique has some potential, especially with more complicated rock formations. I think you could do some pretty strange and fantastical stuff. So I committed to making the video, and I made it. And I think I'm definitely going to work on refining this technique in the future. But thank you so much for watching. We got a number of videos coming out shortly. You can check us out on Facebook for upcoming video release schedules. Any comments, put them in the comments. I answer everything. And have a great day. This was a plaster cloth rock tutorial. All right, have a good one.